So let's move slowly into workshop number one. But I first want to introduce these two wonderful women. I will first start with Sharon Wada. Sharon comes to us from California and currently serves as the interim director of the nonprofit Sustainable Faith. It's a collective of spiritual directors and pastors working to create a spiritually healthy culture among leaders and their communities. That's a beautiful vision if there ever was one. Sharon completed her master's degree in cross cultural studies from Fuller Theological Seminary, and her special interests include multi ethnic issues and leadership development in church and nonprofit ministry, with particular concern for the complexities and contextualization inherent for leaders of color. Sharon is trained in the supervision of spiritual directors through Together in the Mystery, an affiliate of San Francisco Theological Seminary, and she serves on the board of directors for Wellspring and serves on its pastoral team. Yesterday, I was struck by Sharon's pastoral presence, and I offer you one of the taglines on the website from Sustainable Faith, which I hope today shows what kind of intention it will take to foster this life of spiritual formation. And the tagline, it says, "There is a hope for the healing of our world, and there is a table at which we can all feast." So let's please welcome Sharon Wada. And then our second leader today will be Dr. Carrie Myers. Carrie is the co founder of the Stillness Collective, an organization whose mission is to help busy, burdened people find rest, restoration, and stillness through guided Christian meditation, spiritual direction, and retreats. Carrie is a pastoral team member and leader at Vineyard One, New York City, as well as an author of nonfiction books for children, poems, and articles. She has a PhD in English and American literature from NYU. She has been on faculty for NYU, Barnard College, and Hunter College, and the Writing Center director at City Seminary of New York. In addition to her spiritual direction experience, she holds certificates in urban ministry, arts ministry, and Ignatian exercises accompaniment. She's engaged with Spiritual Directors International, the Evangelical Spiritual Directors Association, and is in the network of directors for our own Princeton Theological Seminary, also with Soul Care and Sustainable Faith. She brings to us today this wonderful wealth of experience. And I'd like to welcome Carrie into this space with all of us using Carrie's own words from one of her poems that speaks into the power and possibility of a discerning spiritual path. This is a tiny excerpt from one of Carrie's poems, Ravished by Light. If you ask the sky how it feels to be ravished by light, it will say it isn't able to place a ceiling on loving and being loved. Let us please welcome Dr. Carrie Myers. And with that, we are going to move into our first workshop for the afternoon. Welcome to my world, holistic spiritual formation.
It's nice to see those of you in the room, and especially welcome to those of you online. We have a little more time, so we can move the way Carrie and I prefer, which is we can be a little slower, a little more reflective, and hopefully maybe a little improvising or spontaneous. And so because we have a little more time, the first thing I want to do is just true up my bio. I think there's some outdated information on the internet. So thank you, Nina, for doing your research. And it's a cue that I need to really true up what's out there. So let me just give you a little bit of my ministry, my current ministry mix. So I'm co-director of Sustainable Faith, the nonprofit, alongside founder David Nixon. And I think this is my 7th year of working with the ministry, overseeing the nonprofit, as well as training spiritual directors, and seeing folks for direction and supervision if you are a spiritual director. And I just joined a board of ministry advisors for the Contemplative Center of Silicon Valley, just to give you an idea of what's possible. Those words alone seem like an oxymoron, right? Can you be contemplative in Silicon Valley? And that's what we're about, to create an actual space that says, yes, we can. Those are the two ministries I'm working currently with. Wellspring is a part of my history, a lovely part, but I'm not currently on the board. So, but thank you, Nina, for doing your research. Appreciate that. The other thing I want to do for those of you that are in the room and for online is I want to transition us physically and just become aware of our body and allow our whole selves to show up. So, the way we're going to do that is in kind of a bodily prayer practice. So, I invite those of you here, and if you're at home, just notice where you're sitting in your chair and try to get comfortable. Um, just become in what we say is physically grounded. Maybe put your feet on the floor, notice where there's tension in your body, and just allow yourself to become physically comfortable. And now I invite you to close your eyes and simply notice your breathing. Now just gently become more rhythmic in your breathing by taking about 5 seconds to inhale, hold it and pause, and about 5 seconds to exhale. And now staying in that physical posture with eyes closed, your breathing slowed, bring to the awareness that you are deeply loved by God. He knew you as you were being formed in your mother's womb. He loved you and was pleased with you before you did anything. And so, God, with the awareness that we are loved, we don't have to earn your favor or try harder. We come to you now to learn, to explore, to find joy in the discovery with the assurance that you want us to live life to the full. Thank you, Jesus. Amen. All right. So now we're going to start in our workshop. And when we train spiritual directors, we talk about being a learning community. And that's kind of the environment we're hoping to create in this hybrid way. And you're teaching me how to do this. So I'm learning along with you. And these are the topics or themes we're going to explore. We're going to explore self awareness as a tool for our spiritual journey, considering the context, a bit of a review, and then we'll get specific. Self awareness in the Asian American context and listening in the Asian American context, just shoring up our skills as soul care providers. As we enter into this, I want to give a couple of items for your consideration that come both from the literature of spiritual formation and the fieldwork of spiritual direction. And I offer these as considerations for anyone in soul care ministry. Perhaps they're more of a reminder, especially for those of you that are spiritual directors, as we look to integrate and apply what we heard in the plenary sessions yesterday. We'll try to weave in some personal reflection, and there'll definitely be time for Q&A. So let's dig in. We're going to start with self-awareness, and this is just so we're all on the same page and you know what I think I'm trying to communicate when I use these terms. All right, because we hold a very high value for self-awareness for ourselves as soul care providers, as well as for those we are caring for. So what is it? It is an understanding of who we are, how we think, and how we operate. It's been defined as the ability to make an accurate assessment of your own personality, strengths, and weaknesses. It includes the conscious knowledge of your character, emotions, desires, motivations. And it is not equal to self serving, right? This is for the benefit of your own development as well as for the sake of others. And we can think about like Romans 12:3. Think of yourselves with sober judgment. Well, how do you do that? You have to become aware of who you are. So it's in service to our own formation and for the care of others. Why do we need it? So I'm just going to go even more specifically here. It's necessary to spiritual maturity. Again, yes, referring to yesterday, David began with a quote from John Calvin. There is no deep knowing of God without a deep knowing of self, and no deep knowing of self without a deep knowing of God. It is a vital necessity to be knowing ourselves as we grow and change and who God is calling to us to be and become in those various seasons of life. We get to know God through who we are. Now, the better we know ourselves and our tendencies, the clearer we can see where we need deeper formation into the likeness of Jesus. The more we can bring to Him and make ourselves open to healing, redemption, transformation. And it's essential to our service to others. Our self awareness in the presence of God hopefully fosters a self compassion that allows us to increase our compassion for others. As one spiritual formation author, Suzanne Zucker, has written, the best spiritual guide is a gentle one who is no longer at war with who she has become, and therefore does not need to battle with others as they have been. I don't know about you, but if you recall being in the presence of someone who's comfortable in their own skin, somehow that makes you feel free to be who you are. And that's the kind of soul care providers we're hoping to be and become. So I want to give us a moment to pause right here because doing our inner work directly benefits our outer work. And yet, particularly in our Asian American context, culture, there can be some resistance or even some objections to that pursuit of a healthy inner life or the American lifestyle, right? So I want to just give you a moment to pause and consider what are the first objections, resistances, challenges that come to your mind when you think about your own life context. Okay, so just take 30, 60 seconds to think about that and write them down if you can. And I'm going to look to our technical assistants over here for what might be the best way to collect your responses. And if you are online, type them into your chat because this is going to give us a sense for what are the cultures, the communities that we are living and ministering in. Where are the places of resistance that we might encounter? So you can hear there's a resistance to self awareness because of the fear of what might be exposed. Yeah, that our weaknesses, um, pride, right? Covering up what we don't want anyone to know. That's one theme. Another is I hear the competition for time and space, that life is full and we are focusing our attention, our energies on what we are achieving. Absolutely. One of the things that Carrie and I had the opportunity to do was interview an Asian American pastor who works in a multi generational Asian church. And one of the challenges he talked about is what he called immigrant grit, right? That is the mentality that you work hard and do whatever it takes to survive and succeed. And there's not even an imagination that there would be time or necessity to do self reflection. Um, so, this is just your an awareness of what are you walking into and what are you up against. And potentially, it, it gives us permission to be patient, to go slow, and to cry out for grace. Lord, give us the grace that you meet us where we are and you desire to move us forward. All right. So, more on the context. So, we've talked a lot about this yesterday, but I just want to be explicit. What do we mean by context? Now, if you just look it up in the dictionary, you'll see things like environment, setting, interrelated conditions in which something exists or occurs. And I've given this kind of working definition for us as soul care providers. The contexts are the particularities of our everyday lives that frame our human existence, individually and corporately, the human reality seen and unseen. And furthermore, it's what our minds rely on. It helps us interpret and make sense of our experience and discern God's leading. Okay, so the context matters. We're doing contextualization all the time. We might not realize it. And most importantly, God meets us in the human context. He cares about our human condition, and it is the foundation for kingdom compassion and justice. It is the answer to our struggles and our brokenness. Have been particularly helped and resourced by a book by Dr. Daniel Lee at Fuller Seminary. And he writes God sees and interacts with every people and every person in their particularity for their reconciliation and vocation. And that's the hope that we hold, that God meets us in our particulars. And for us, particularly as spiritual directors, um, perhaps for some of you as coaches or therapists, when we are helping folks to make that bridge into their spirituality, we as directors often say we're dusting for the fingerprints of God. Right? Where are the places that God is meeting us in our human particularities? And when we do that, looking at our human context, what this conference has highlighted is that that human context is multidimensional. It includes the intrapersonal, what's going on inwardly, the interpersonal, what's happening between people, but it also includes the systems and structures and all the environment, nature. And I want to draw our attention to that because I'm speaking now as a spiritual director. Our tendency is to focus on the first two spheres of human experience, and that's primarily the intrapersonal and the interpersonal. And so, um, I've had lots and lots of conversations with Dr. David Chow, by the way. So we have worked together to integrate theology and practice. And one of the things that he said in our conversation is you can't understand your inner world without understanding your outer world. So even if we are a soul care practitioner that tends to focus on our inner world, we are served by taking a look at the external context. All right. Now, one of the ways that we as spiritual directors and spiritual formation pastors often rely on for exploring what's going on with God is called the prayer of examen. And this was a prayer that was first developed by Ignatius of Loyola. And we're talking just around the time of the Reformation. So he was bringing about reform within the Catholic tradition. He's a contemporary historically of Luther. And he developed a way of praying with God that explores what is happening in your everyday life. And so we often use this because it's an easy way to dust for the fingerprints of God. And all you do is you carve out a few moments of solitude in the midst of a busy day. It can be done on a subway. We don't recommend closing your eyes if you're driving, but if you're dropping off kids and you're waiting for them to get out of soccer practice, it's just a few moments. And it allows you to focus on what's going on and where are your actions and choices being invited. First of all, where are they coming from and where are they being invited to go? So it's a form of discernment. There are many, many forms of the examen out there. So if you Google prayer of examen, you will get one for daily. You might get one for monthly. There's an annual examen. And you can tailor these to fit what is the awareness that you are hoping to cultivate. An easy way, if you're looking at your day, what was life giving and what drained energy? And then over time, you get a sense of a pattern. But for our purposes, what I want to invite us to consider is looking at those three circles that David introduced us to yesterday, because typically the prayer of examen is used in the bottom circle, me and my family or primary relationships, work relationships. But what if we expand our question of what was life giving, what was draining in the middle circle? Now, for our purposes, I've called it society or the context outside my front door, beyond my front door. And that was because when I grew up as a Japanese American, my experience was we had a private and a public life. And the way we functioned as a family would be that bottom circle. But the way we functioned in society would be that middle circle. And we had two ways. I guess that's what we call code switching. We didn't know what that was back then. Um, so that's why I called it what happens when you step out of that front door and to ask, okay, what was life giving and what was draining? And the larger circle of God's economy, in my mind, it's a reminder that God is in it all. He is the broader context um, for my for my existence. And so, where am I experiencing Him in that bottom circle? Where am I experiencing Him in that middle circle? And the middle circle is important because we're taking a look at the context of migration and subsequent racialization. And so, if you ignore that, you are going to miss a significant piece of the experience and unfolding narrative for Asian Americans. A couple of examples for myself. Um, I brought to my own spiritual director once just a comment in on a leadership team about my communication style, and it just pushed all my buttons. Though in the moment I didn't say much, and it was kind of this. I'm not. I mean, basically, what I heard is I'm not really understanding you. Is that because you have an indirect communication style as an Asian? Now, what did I hear? I heard the default is more of an explicit, just tell me what you need style. And I heard it is your job to adapt. So I simply bring that to direction, unpack it with my director, and let God love in the midst of that dilemma. I often hear in spiritual direction what starts with a leadership struggle, it moves towards a wrestling with the imbalance of power, right? That the dominant culture norms in the workplace, it already tips the power scale. And the question of who has to adapt, right? So those are just the kinds of things that I've experienced or hear as we look at those first two circles. Okay. Because now what I want to do is really shift us to our practice as soul care providers and take a look at how are we listening to the people that God has brought into our care. And Carrie is going to lead us through that.
So, I'm going to talk a little bit about the art of listening, and it is an art. It is something that most of us have to work on and cultivate. And more than an art, I want to say that it is a ministry. It is a gift that you give to the person you are with. It is an act of love. And it is a way to show them that God also loves and values them. And so it is well worth polishing up our skills and our art. Now, Sharon has just talked about context. And with that, I want to add that listening is also context dependent. And I'll read this quote from Elizabeth Lieber. When the notion of religious experience is broadened to include the interpersonal and the social and structural, and all arenas are seen as a theater of the experience of the mystery of God, the spiritual director's task and the supervisor's is immensely widened. And I just want to sit with that phrase for a little bit. All arenas are seen as the theater of the experience of the mystery of God. Because it lets us into something holy, that it is all the purview of God. That everything that happens in your life, as Sharon said, are places to dust for God's fingerprints. And I want to say that part of this context is when we think about Asian American communities and when we think about diversity. As we know, there are commonalities among different Asian ethnic groups, as well as differences. Probably the most salient commonality is racialization. In the United States, we have shared physical features, and people make assumptions about us based on those shared physical features. And yet, within those similarities, there are many variations. Our migration experience is different. Our experience of trauma and loss is different. Our country of origin, our generation in the US. So, for example, um, if you look at my family history, depending on which of my grandparents you count from, I'm either third or fourth generation. On my mother's side, I'm Filipina and Japanese. On my father's side, I'm full Okinawan. They grew up in Hawaii. That gives me a very different experience from someone that grew up in the mainland US. Um, as part of my own story as an adult, I married a white person, which means my kids have multi-ethnic experience, right? And so my story is very different from another Asian American that I'm sitting across from. And so even though we have commonalities, there are things that I cannot assume about their story. And so I want to move to this left side of the slide. What are we listening for? We're listening for content and feelings and interpretation. So what does the person say? What are they talking about? What are their emotions? What are their effective responses to what they've experienced? And then interpretations or the meaning of what they say. And again, we don't want to assume that we know the correct interpretation. And this is one of the reasons as spiritual directors that we practice reflecting back what we have heard without judgments, because that gives us an opportunity not only to let the person hear that they are heard and understood and process further, but it gives them an opportunity to correct us if we are wrong. You know, if I say, so I hear that you said you had experience A or experience B, they can say, well, that's partly correct, but really what I was feeling was this, right? They can speak back to me. And that gives them a little more insight into their experience and also gives me a little more insight into their experience. And so it's part of this unfolding dance of communication and speaking and listening that we undergo in soul care. We leave space for the speaker to process, to correct us, to adjust, and we go with what they are telling us. And the second part, be prepared to bracket your assumptions. Now, what is bracketing? We talk about this in our spiritual direction training. It's basically the experience of hearing internal chatter or noise in your own head. Something that gets in the way of you being fully present to the person that you are listening to. And when you notice that internal noise, you notice it and then you put it aside to deal with later. The goal is not to let what's happening in your head interfere with your ability to be present with this person. So, for example, an example of internal noise would be, I really relate to what this person is saying. It's like this experience that I had. Or their experience brings up a memory, it brings up a kinship. You feel close to that person. That is actually not going to help you listen to that person then because your experiences will start to intrude. So you want to bracket that. Um, but you also might feel opposite feelings, feelings of repulsion, feelings of questioning or confusion. Those are also things you bracket because they keep you from being present. These are not good things or bad things. All of us have internal chatter. We are human beings. We have reactions. All of this internal chatter is an opportunity to put it aside and to come back to it later when you are not in a space of soul care and work it out with your own spiritual direction provider, your soul care provider. All this internal chatter is an opportunity to see how God wants to meet you in your life. But for the moment, you are concerned with the person in front of you and what God is doing in their life. So it's important to separate out those two things. Other examples of internal chatter might be boredom, might be your own insecurity. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know what to say next. All that again is normal. It's normal to be tired. It's normal to not feel well. So I want to give you a lot of grace and ask you to give yourself a lot of grace when you are in the mode listener. Listening is hard work. It is not often, all the time, intuitive. There are things that you have to pay attention to. But again, God is working in all of it. It is all an invitation to see where God is moving. Okay. So, because part of our goal for today is to offer professional development to people that are in the soul care space, to spiritual directors, to pastors, to ministers, to social workers, to anyone who is offering soul care. These are kind of what we want to sum up for professional development. So, first, in order to be a good listener in an Asian American space, become familiar with the history and the pressure and pain points for Asian Americans. And in a way, this is what we did yesterday, right? Migration pressure, racialization pressure, family context pressure, the things we mentioned earlier today, that your pride gets in the way, that it's hard to be vulnerable, that your family doesn't support that. Um, we invite you, if you would like to find a spiritual director, supervisor, coach, or mentor of color. Someone who understands the dynamics of being in a white normative space and the pressure that puts on you and your spirituality. And then we invite you to expand your awareness of the social landscape. You can take the intercultural development inventory or the What's in My Knapsack survey. And actually, Sharon, if you would like to speak about those.
Yeah, those last two are things that we've been experimenting with. And they're kind of in that space of the DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion formation. So the Intercultural Development Inventory, or IDI, is something you would take with someone who is, I guess, certified is what they call it, to administer it. And it's a full assessment both of your attitudes, your orientation, and your behaviors. So it's something in sustainable faith that we are just starting to explore. And so a couple of us took it, and we are people of color that took it. And we were kind of surprised with our results, but kind of not. So for myself, in terms of my attitudes or awarenesses, scored somewhat high in terms of intercultural development, but in actual behavior, there's a lag in what I'm actually doing and experiencing. And thus far as I've interacted with my own results, I think for myself, it's because my default is to assimilate, to minimize the differences. And there was a kind of an observation question yesterday out of the plenary. Why is it that I feel uncomfortable as an Asian gathering with other Asians when there are non Asians around me? Right? There's this feeling of not wanting to be seen as different. And I really think it's tied to a history of being othered, and being other is bad. So it showed up in this IDI. Um, and it didn't seem like it when I was taking it. It seemed like very neutral, like irrelevant questions to some extent, but it came out. So it was really helpful just to give me feedback of where am I in that process. And then the other one, which is called What's in My Knapsack, is an informal survey that you can Google and take. It was developed by Peggy McIntosh in the 1980s. And Peggy was an educator in higher education. And she noticed that there was a discrepancy among staff and instructors between men and women in terms of power and privilege. And so she started to do a little bit of research and investigation into this, and she quickly noticed it's not just between men and women, but it's between the different races as well. And so that led her to develop a whole inventory, and that's what she calls "What's in My Knapsack." Now, she called it white privilege, and she is white, so she named it as it is. When I offer it, I changed it to social assets because maybe it's part of my Asianness and I'm just trying to avoid controversy, but what I'm trying to do is introduce the concept in a non-confrontational way so that we can engage with where are we actually. And so I call it social assets, and I've administered it to different groups of directors, teachers, groups like this of about 15 to 20. And what you do is you rate yourself in terms of your experience out and about in society in that middle circle, basically, of the three circles we looked at yesterday. So you rate your experience and then you self identify. Do you self identify primarily as white, Asian, Latino, or Black? And then you just post your results, right? And as a group, we take an average. And I've done this 4 or 5 times, and every time the ranking is always the same. Whites come out high, then Asians, then Latino, and then Black. And so, again, it's just a quick snapshot. This is where we're at. This is the context in which God is going to meet us. So I just offer those 2 things as ways to expand your awareness in that middle circle, both for yourselves and for the people that you are caring